Okay. Okay. This week's Sedra is Parshas Vayishlach. Now, it discusses the encounter. The beginning of the Sedra discusses the encounter between Yaakov and Esav, and Yaakov is very fearful that Esav is coming to wage war against him. He's fearful of the consequences of the meeting that would take place. The malachim, the angels, some say it was angels, and some say it was regular agents of Yaakov who went to talk to Esav, to offer Esav a present, and on Yaakov's behalf. And in a sense, Esav apparently gave them the impression that he's coming to wage war against Yaakov, and Yaakov is overtaken with fear and trepidation. He separates his camp into two, and just in case Esav wipes out one camp, the other camp will survive. And there's a very strong sense of desperation. And ultimately, Yaakov, Esav, all of a sudden, instead of killing Yaakov, all of a sudden he kisses Yaakov, and he offers to accompany Yaakov, and Yaakov says, "No, my children are very young yet. We have to go at a slow pace. You go. Eventually, I'll come to see you in Seir." That was the place where Esav dwelt. And the question is, and I raised this question last year, why all of a sudden this change in Esav? He's coming with Arba Meos Ish, and there are all kinds of theories. It wasn't just 400 people, depending on which medrash you look at. He's coming in full battle gear. He's coming, the impression that Yaakov was given that he's coming to destroy and to kill. And all of a sudden, there's a complete change. And how are we to understand this change? And last year, I suggested that there was a difference between the perspective of Esav and the perspective of Yaakov. Esav was concerned about the present. You see, even when he sold the Bechorah, what did he say? Anochi holech lomos v'lama li bechorah. What is the reward of the birthright? The reward of the birthright is something that's going to be generations later. I'm concerned about the now. So, and the pot of lentil soup that Esav drank, that he sold the Bechorah for, was worth more in the present for him than the Bechorah of the future. Esav was concerned about the present, but Yaakov was concerned about the future. And it was when Esav came and recognized that Yaakov was mainly concerned about the future, and he was concerned about the present. In the present, Yaakov said, "Adoni Esav, my master Esav." Because of this, Esav had no reason anymore to try to do battle with Yaakov. And on the contrary, he saw Yaakov as perhaps trying to be an ally of his, join his nation. The Yaakov said, of course, Chazal tell us it never happened, that he said that he will go Seira to see Esav. So because of the difference in the perspective, Esav being concerned about the present and Yaakov being concerned about the future, there was no conflict. and they were able to let each other go in their own way in peace. I want to explain this answer that I gave last year. It could be a different approach, but I think it explains that approach also. Now, also at the end of the Sedra, the Torah tells us that Esav left Eretz Canaan mipnei Yaakov Achiv, because the land was not big enough for the wealth of both of them, for their cattle. And obviously, as the Mefarshim point out, certainly Eretz Canaan was big enough, but it meant at their residence, their place of residence, where Yitzchak dwelt, the place was not big enough, that area was not big enough for both of them to be there. But one wonders, why was Esav so accommodating that he says to Yaakov, I don't know if he said it, but Yaakov, you stay here, and I'm going to stay here. It seems that Yaakov already had some kind of establishment at Seir, because he mentioned, Yaakov said to him when they met, he said that I will go to Seir to see you. So, but Esav is very accommodating. When Yaakov comes, he leaves. Instead of saying, this is my area. Why this change in attitude? And it had to do with the present to a certain degree, rather than the future. And I think we could explain it by taking notice of another question. In Parshas Vayishlach, in regard to Mechias Amalek, in regard to the mitzvah of destroying Amalek, Muchamal Hashem b'Amalek midor dor, there's a battle for God or by God against Amalek from generation to generation. The Torah says, Ki mocho emche zecha Amalek mitachas hashamayim. God says, I will destroy the remembrance of Amalek from underneath the heavens. Put this as a remembrance of the book. I will destroy Amalek. And this is the destruction of Amalek that takes place in the future. And in the Mechilta deals with a lot of questions, with the question of Zeicher Amalek. It should say either Kimacho Emcha Amalek mitachas hashamayim. Why does it say Zeicher Amalek mitachas hashamayim? And one of the explanations is Amalek, that's Amalek. Zeicher zu Agog, that's Agog. Agog was the king of Amalek in the time of Shaul. And when Shaul wiped out all the males of Amalek, he let Agog continue to live. And ultimately Shmuel comes, and Shmuel kills Agag. But first he says, just like you made many Jewish women lose their children, so too shall your mother lose her child. And the Rambam says that the reason he said that, because that's part of the mitzvah of the Zeicher Amalek. In other words, when we go to war against Amalek, we have to know why we're going to war against Amalek, who Amalek is, and the danger that Amalek poses for the Jewish nation. So, but in any case, Agag was also Amalek. So what does the pasuk say? Ki mocho emche zecher Amalek mitachas shamayim. I will annihilate, destroy, kill Amalek. And not just Amalek, but the zecher of Amalek, the remembrance of Amalek also. And who is that? That's Agag. Well, Agag was the king of Amalek. So what's the chiddush? What are we being told? But on the basis of the Rambam and the Moreh Nevuchim, regarding Psukim in this week's Fedra, we could understand it. The Rambam and Moreh Nevuchim is somewhat, if I could use the word, perplexed as to why, or questions. I shouldn't say perplexed, even though that was the name of the Sefer. The question is, at the end of this week's Sedra, first he discusses why the Torah has to tell us about all of Amalek, the different tribes of Amalek, the descendants of Esav, the descendants of Esav. Vayla told us Esav who Edom, and who were the kings and all that. So he says the first thing is because we know that Amalek was a descendant of Esav. But the mitzvah of Mocho Timche Zecher Amalek, of wiping out the nation of Amalek, that mitzvah is only against Amalek. It's not against all of Esav. So but the different descendants of Amalek lived in close proximity to each other. So it was important to know, the Rambam says, the different families of Amalek, because the mitzvah of waging war against Amalek is only Amalek, not the other descendants of Esav, of course, unless they attack us first or they pose a danger to us. So that's why the Torah mentioned. But then he asks the question, why is it important to tell us about the names of the 8 kings that Amalek had before, like that Esav had, the 8 kings of the nations of Esav, that Esav had before there was a king in Israel? And the Rambam says, because when it comes to having a king in Israel, the halacha was only a Jew could be appointed king. Once David and Shlomo became king, it had to be someone from Shevet Yehuda. But the beforehand, it could be from another Shevet. Shaul was from Shevet Binyamin. So the Torah wants to point out the difference, that the other nations of the world at that time, when they selected a king, the kings were from outside the area. They were foreigners. And the Medrash tells us about Balak also, that he was a foreigner. But because of his hatred of the Jewish people, he was taken by Moab. He was taken by Moab to be their king. So the custom of the nations of the world at that time was to select as a king not somebody from within their own ranks, but on the contrary, to take somebody from outside their ranks. But the Jewish people were unique. From among your brothers, you shall appoint for you a king. And the Torah wanted to point out the contrast between Esav, who the kings of Esav were from outside, the descendants of Esav, from foreign lands. And perhaps reasons could be explained. You could say, a Navi Biro. In other words, a king requires a certain degree of awe. And there was a fear, perhaps among the nations of the world, that someone that grew up among them will be their buddy. And a king has to be someone who has some reverence. And they didn't have it within them. Or some people are always impressed with somebody from the outside rather than from somebody from the inside. But whatever it is, that was the reason. That's what the Rambam Moreh Nevuchim says. Now, so we could suggest that to a certain degree, this is the reason why we needed a special pasuk, because it's possible that Agag himself was not from Amalek. Of course, there might have been marriages afterwards where people came from Amalek. And there were some of his descendants might have been from Amalek. So we need a special pasuk to tell us that even though he was not from Amalek, but the mitzvah of Machot Timcha Zech Amalek applied to him also, because he was the king, being the king of Amalek. So he's the Zeicher Amalek. So there's an extra word to imply that there were individuals who were associated with Amalek, that the mitzvah of Mechemes Amalek, of Machot Timcha Zeicher Amalek, applied to them also. There were other possible answers also. So we see that. So that's why there's a special pasuk, special word, Zeicher Amalek, to tell us that we have to Amalek, getting rid of Agag was part of the mitzvah of Machot Timcha Zeicher Amalek. Now it's very interesting that Esav, that Yaakov, when he has his encounter with Esav, he bows down to him 7 times. He bows down to him, and he refers to him. He refers to him as Adoni Esav, my master Esav. And Chazal tell us that that's why the Torah tells us later on that there were 8 kings. This was a punishment, so to say, for Yaakov. 8 kings among the descendants of Esau before there was 1 king among the Jewish people. There is a discussion when we say 1 king in front, before there's a king by the Jewish people. Does the king of the Jewish people mean Moshe Rabbeinu? Or does the king mean Shaul HaMelech? And those who say that it has reference to Shaul HaMelech, in other words, the simple explanation is that it was given B'mara HaNevuah. Okay, that's something that would need a separate share in itself to discuss. But Yaakov refers to Adoni Esav, and the Medrash is critical on one hand of Yaakov for referring, for bowing down. He says, who told Yaakov to contact Esav, that he should have to bow down to him and say, Adoni Esav, my master Esav? And then there's another Medrash right near it in the Medrash Rabbah, and it says how Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rabbi Yehuda the prince, the spiritual leader of the Jewish people, the author, the one who brought together the Mishnah, the Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, that he had to deal with Rome. He had a very good relationship with Antoninus, who was the Caesar of Rome, the king of Rome, and when he had to deal with the leaders of Rome, he would refer to them as Adoni, as my master, as my master. And the question is, why did he refer to them? So people were critical of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi because he was the leader of the Jewish people on one hand, and the other hand, he belittles himself and refers to the leaders when he talks to the leaders of Rome as Adoni, my master. Apparently, he thought perhaps he didn't have to do it. Now, so the question is, on one hand, the Medrash says that Yaakov did not act properly in referring to as Adoni, my master. And then the other hand, it says that Rabbi Yehuda used Yaakov's actions as a precedent for how he should act. Now, I heard an explanation from my father. I have my own explanation. And my father said, the Maisa Avos similar bonim, the deeds of the Avos are assigned for the children, in other words, how to act. Koma Shira Labo Sira Labonim. It's the things that happened. There's some similarity between the events that took place in the lives of the Avos that took place in later generations also. And what the Avos did, the way the Avos acted, that is a guide for how we should act. And my father said that means sometimes, not always, when there were two ways to act, even though the Avos might have acted in a way that was not the preferable way. We're not saying Chas v'Shalom that did something wrong. The Avos didn't do anything wrong in the fullest sense of the word, Chas v'Shalom. But there were two approaches that could be taken. And the Avos took one approach. So future generations have to take that same approach also. In other words, God, in a sense, molded history, molded the future on the basis of the events that took place in the lives of the Avos. Now, to be honest, I had a lot of trouble with that, because I understood my Savo similar bonin not so much that the events, that it was the past that causes the future, but on the contrary, it's the future that caused the past. In other words, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, knowing everything that was going to take place in future generations, set up the Avos as a guide for the future. Although I have to say that I think that what my father said is similar to something that I heard in the name of Rav Aaron Kotler, Zatzal. I remember I was in 8th grade at the time, I think, when Rav Aaron Kotler passed away. And at that time, I went for elementary school. I went to Yeshivas Rabbeinu Yaakov Yosef. And although Rabbi Aaron Kotler he had his own yeshiva in Lakewood, but he had a very big influence in the yeshiva of Rabbi Yaakov Yosef. Many of the Rebbeim were his early Talmidim, some Talmidim of his in Europe, and some Talmidim of his from the early years in the United States. And at that time, I went to the Levaya also. But I remember at the Shloshim, Mr. Irving Bunim, who was the president of Rabbeinu Yaakov Yosef of the yeshiva, he spoke the Shloshim. He also spoke at the Levaya. But at the Levaya, he spoke in Yiddish. So at that time, it was not so easy for me. It was not so easy for me to it was not so easy for me to understand what he was saying. But at the Shloshim, he repeated over the story. He was probably one of the Balabatim that was closest to Rabban Kotler. That's why they had him speak at the Levaya and at the Shloshim. And he was an outstanding person. There's no question about it, especially considering what America was like in his early years. He was one of the leaders of the Young Israel movement, which saved so many Jews on a religious level. And he said that once Rabban Kotler had a meeting in an office, I don't remember if it was the Agudas Yisrael office or some office that was around the corner from his law office. And then he not expected, Rabban Kotler came, if I recall the way he said it, just unexpectedly came to his office, and he says he wants to tell him over a thought that happened to be on this week's Sedra. And in this week's Sedra, Yaakov comes to Sukkos, and he builds a house for his family, ulemikneu, and for his cattle, asa Sukkos. He made temporary dwellings, huts. He made huts for his cattle. And therefore, he called the name Sukkos. It's very strange. On one hand, and I saw later on that some of the Mefarshim already, the Or Chaim asked this question. Just because he made huts for his cattle, so he called the name of the place huts. In other words, a person comes to a place and he builds a house for himself, for his family, for all those that are with him, and for his animals, he makes a barn. And he calls the name of the place barn. How are we to understand it? How are we to understand this? So Rabban Kotler said, this was the Eva Hayarte. It was the other side, what we call today the West Bank. It was the Eva Hayarte. So the
East Bank.
The East Bank. I'm sorry, the East Bank. You're right. Okay, so it was the East Bank, and we in the future. So the Bnei Ruvain and the Bnei Gad, they would ask Moshe that this land they shouldn't have to move over to the West Bank. I'm sorry, they shouldn't move over to the West Bank, and that they should be able to. They should be because that was a good land for their cattle, and they should be able to stay there. And he says Sukkos, the city, the area called Sukkos, was on the east bank, was there. So he says, and if I recall correctly, and it's many, many years ago, don't want to say how many years ago, but he said, so you should know that Eretz Yisrael is Eretz Yisrael, he said, because of what happened to the Yavos, not because of us, not because of the Zionist leaders and whatever it is. It's because of what happened to the Yavos. And he says, and Yaakov knew that. So that's why, my impression is, he said that's why he stayed there, and to sort of say, to prepare the way for the future. Ma'isa abo siman labanim. He didn't, I don't recall him using those words, Ma'isa abo siman labanim. But the way he explained it, my impression, my youthful impression, I should say, was that the events of the future happen because of the past, which is similar to the idea that my father suggested. It's a little different, but similar to the idea. So, however, I want to suggest that a different reason for it, and that is that Yaakov. I think that the real reason why he the real reason he said that was because the reason he did it was because Yaakov was really not supposed to stay in Sukkot. As I'll say, he was punished for it. He stayed 1.5 years there. Why? Because he should have gone back to Yitzchak and to the part of the land that was Eretz Yisrael at that time. The East Bank was not yet Eretz Yisrael. So why is it that but Yaakov wanted to show that he didn't have intention of staying there permanently. A bias is a permanent structure. A sukkah, diras harai, a hut, is a temporary structure. So he wanted to make known to the people at that time and for future generations that his dwelling away from the land of his ancestors, of Abraham and Yitzchak, was temporary. It wasn't permanent. So he called it after the huts, after the barns, if you want, which were temporary dwellings, in order to emphasize that area is temporary. However, in order to answer the contradiction, I think the answer in the Medrash Rabbah is different than my father suggested, or we could say an additional explanation. The answer is, the Medrash Rabbah is very clear that when it becomes necessary, we have to say, Adoni Esav, my master Esav. We have to recognize who's in power. Of course, there are certain limitations. But the Medrash is critical of Yaakov because Yaakov created a meeting between Yaakov and Esav. In other words, Esav, and it seems from the words of the Medrash Rabbah there, Esav was in his own place. He was in Seir. He wasn't involved with Yaakov. But Yaakov sent him agents, messengers. So he created a situation where he has to say, Adoni Esav. There were times in Jewish history when we had to talk to the bishops of the town. We had to be involved with them because they were in charge. But it's not something we should look forward to. And when it's not necessary, it's not necessary. We do not have to have religious dialogues. We can have a dialogue. It doesn't have to be just religious leaders about crime, about civil rights, about war. But we don't need religious dialogues. We shouldn't force a meeting if we don't have to about these topics. Let each person observe his own religion in his own way. Yaakov did not have to meet Esau. That's what the Medrash is critical. Yes, once a meeting took place, he had to say, Adoni Esau, my master Esau. Once a meeting took place, he had to say Adoni Esau. But at that time, but who asked him to make the meeting? Why did he send messengers? That's what the Medrash is critical about. Now, but we see what terminology did he use, even under those circumstances. He says Adoni Esau when he talked to him. He did say, Beis Halevi discusses it. He said, Hatzileni, when he says his tefillah, his prayer to God, he says, Hatzileni na miyad achi miyad Esav. Save me from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esav. And the Beis Halevi asked the question. It's a very obvious question. He says, why did he say, Hatzileni na miyad achi miyad Esav? Save me from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esav. Why did he should just say, save me from the hand of my brother Esav. Why the hand of my brother, the hand of Esav? Why repeat the word hand twice? But Beis Halevi says that Yaakov knew that there were two ways that Esav could come. Esav could come in friendliness, in brotherhood, as a family member. But even there, he had to be fearful. He had to be fearful on one hand because of the impact and the influence, the negative impact and the negative influence, the use of the association, and the trickery. Lavan. Also, it was friendliness, his relative, his son-in-law. But nevertheless, Yaakov has to run away. And Lavan is determined, in a sense, even to kill him. We say in the Haggadah, Lavan Vayishlach Parshas. Lavan wanted to destroy everything. Paralo Gazar el Ascharim, the Lavan Vayishlach Parshas. And what did Lavan say? Habanim banai v'habanos benosai. So even when he came to try to kill that Yaakov, but God appeared to him and stopped it. He came as a family member. Habanim banai v'habanos benosai. So we have to be fearful of the family attitude, the positive attitude. But then if Esav comes the way Esav is, the murderer. So, Hatzilenina miyad Esav, save me from the hand of Esav also. whichever way Esav comes, we have to be fearful. Esav could come as the general of an army. We have to be fearful. But if he comes as a brother, we also have to be fearful. And I think what I want to suggest that at the time when Esav was concerned about Yaakov, that Yaakov is going to be establishing a nation that will be stronger than his nation. And in a sense, he wanted to nip it in the bud. So he gets his soldiers. He gets his soldiers ready to attack. And he gets his soldiers ready to attack. And then all of a sudden, Yaakov says, Adoni Esav. Esav, look what I have here. I am not raising a nation. Certainly in the present, there is no nation here. No attempt to make a nation. You want a nation. You want to be the leader of a nation, the master of the nation. You can have it. Adoni Esav. I just want to establish a family. This is my family that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave me. Esav encountered something completely different than he imagined. He saw there wasn't a real competition between him and Yaakov. They were interested in different things. Esav was interested, even in his time, in establishing a nation, whereas Yaakov was interested in establishing a family. Now, the idea of a melech. What is the idea of a melech? A melech, a king. And that's a melech, a king, represents the idea of nationhood. Now, the Jewish people are both a family and a nation. Matter of fact, I've mentioned it before. The Medrash tells us that the way the Jewish people were around the coffin of Yaakov, the Shvatim, the way they stood around the coffin of Yaakov, when they went to Eretz Canaan to bury Yaakov in the Maras HaMachpelah, that's the way they surrounded as Shvatim, the Mishkan in the Midbar, the desert. What's the idea by the Medrash? But I think the idea of the Medrash is the following. Usually, so long as the patriarch and matriarch of the family is alive, there are strong bonds between the members of the family. Certainly in the old days, I've seen a change take place. But in the old days, when the grandparents were there, all the children, all the grandchildren, they would all come to the grandparents' house, the grandparents' apartment, small as it was. There was always room for everybody else. There was bonds between the cousins, between the brothers and sisters, that kept them as a family. But last time they come together figuratively as a family is at the Levaya, at the funeral, at the burial of the matriarch and the patriarch. But Klal Yisrael was supposed to remain as a family, not just as a nation. They went in the Midbar. The Midbar represents the Jews of Golus, the Jews of Mitzrayim. How did the Jewish people survive? Why was it necessary? when you're in exile, you're not a nation. You are a family. A nation that's just a nation cannot survive years and years in exile. But when that nation is a family, it can survive and goes also. A nation to survive needs a land. But if it's a family, you could be in one end of the world and somebody be 180 degrees around the globe. There's still a connection. There's family connections. You don't see them for years. And they are brought up in one situation and you are brought up in another situation. But when you come together, you're still family. But that's not true about citizenship in a country. When you leave the land after a while, you're no longer part of that land. So Esav, he saw that he had different interests than Yaakov. There wasn't a big problem. Yaakov, at least for the present, was only interested in having a family. Esav was interested in building his own nation. Esav nasati is harseya l'reshes so. Yaakov ubonav yardu mitzrayma. And so that's why around the Aron, around the Mishkan, the Jewish people stood in the same order that they did around the Aron of Yaakov, because the traveling, a family sticks together in traveling. A nation doesn't stick together. The Jewish people had to be, yes, they became a nation, but it had to be a nation that was based on being a family. So now I think, in a certain sense, the area where Yitzchak lived, where Yaakov was going, and where Esav dwelt. Now it seems, on one hand, Esav is already at Seir when he meets Yaakov. On the other hand, it appears, although there's discussion in the Mefarshim, it seems that Esav left Eretz Canaan later when Yaakov came there. But it seems that Esav began to establish. I know there are all kinds of explanations in the Rishonim, but I just want to suggest he established his relationship. He was beginning to establish his country or his nation, or the foundation for his nation would be a better way to put it, before Yaakov came in Seir. But in Canaan, by Yitzchak, near Yitzchak, in the area where Yitzchak dwelt, that was the family site. That's where his family was. But when that area became too big for both him and Yaakov, he had no problems leaving, because his feeling was, first of all, he probably did not want to be too close to Yaakov. But besides that, to him, the more he remained there, he saw familyhood as a negation of nationhood. Because of this, he used the opportunity to go away with Yaakov Achiv, in front of Yaakov, his brother. Let Yaakov be the family man, and I will be, Esav thought to himself, the man with the nation. And I think that so this was the reason. This was the reason why the Esav was able to come come to terms, was able to come to terms with Yaakov, with Yaakov's situation, I would say. But when it came to burial, people like to be in their family plot. When it comes to burial, there Esav was concerned that he be seen as part of the family. And that's why Esav, first of all, when it came to bury Yitzchak, so he insisted that he have the first place. When it comes to burial, and you see very often when families come together, now families today are not the way they used to be, but they do get together in a very strong way. And at situations, at funerals, where the matriarch, patriarch passes away. And there, Esav wanted to see himself as the head of the family. And even when they wanted to bury Yaakov, when it came to burial, Esav wanted to see himself as a family person. Where, in terms of living, he wanted to live as the leader of a nation. And as a leader of a nation, he did not want to focus on familyhood. But when it came to burial, there the focus was on family. So that's why he demanded to be buried in the Maras HaMachpelah, And this is but Yaakov, and Yaakov is the one who goes to Golus, because in Golus, in exile, we can only stay together if we have a family attitude. We can't rely on a national attitude, independent, without a family attitude as well. Okay.
If anyone has a question, please put it in the chat. One question is, we see that later Mordechai did not use the same approach of.
So I was expecting that question. The answer is that the Gzeres HaKosov tells us. Now, first of all, we don't see that. On the contrary, the question is the reverse. The question is, how did he take the Beis Esav? All the Mefarshim asked. He got the house of Esav. So how did he get the house of Esav? You're not allowed to. You have to destroy everything from Esav. Okay, there's at least 1 million answers to that question, but so now you have an additional answer. But the point is, you could say the Gzeres HaKosov is that Agag is considered part of Esav, and then you can rely on the 1 million answers. The simple answer is it belonged to Achashverosh. That's one thing. Secondly, Rashi in Shmuel says that the mitzvah Zecher Amalek, destroying the memory of Amalek, Shor V'Sed, that's only the animals of Amalek. It doesn't have reference to the houses of Amalek. And why the animals of Amalek? Because, okay, this has to be understood. Maybe Purim time, I'll give a share on it. Because they were Balek Shafim, they were magicians, and they made themselves look like animals, which wasn't hard for Amalek, believe me. They made themselves look like animals, so there was a fear that the animals of Amalek were, this is what Rashi says, I have a different explanation of the Rashi, but the simple explanation of Rashi is, so they made themselves look like animals, so consequently, they had to destroy the animals of Amalek. Okay, what's the next question?
No, the question actually was, why did Mordechai refuse to bow? Why didn't he take the approach of Adoni Esav?
Why did he take? Because the Medrash says Esav wore and about the
Haman.
That question, Haman wore a avodah zarah on him.
Okay, if anyone else has
also, there was another Medrash that he was the. Okay, even that has to be understood, but that Haman originally was the slave of Mordechai. So okay, whatever. Yeah. Yeah. What's the next question?
Is that why they didn't, Jews didn't bow in the time of the Yavanim? Hannah and her sons.
It was because it was Avodah Zarah.
Avodah Zarah.
Also, there it was Shas Hashmad. Shas Hashmad, you don't bow. You don't do anything, Shas Hashmad.
The Shmad was when they were trying to either to
They get them
destroy
to
Judaism.
they see them. Yeah, that's right. Shas Hashmad.
Okay, there
That
aren't
would
any
have
other.
been a rejection of Yahadus there. By Yaakov, it wasn't a rejection of Yahadus. The emphasis of the Medrash is not so much on the bowing, although I think there's a quick reference. It's the fact that he said Adoni. So Yaakov felt that Adoni, that represented the leadership, not familyhood. So that's why. Yeah.
Any other? There are no. Well, what constitutes a Shas Hashmad? What distinguishes it from diplomacy today? Well, there's a
Shas Hashmad is where they make a decree in order to get the Jews to separate themselves from the Jewish customs and the Jewish mitzvahs.
Right. Okay. So there aren't any other questions here. Thank you everyone for joining.